Okay, my name is Ray Brassieur, is how we pronounce it in French, Brassieur. And you might say Brassieur, or you could say it in many different ways. The name, my last name, by the way, is part of this story because it is an Acadian name, but its spelling has changed and changed over the years, but it changed even within families. So my dad, for example, had 10 brothers and 1 sister. And within that group of siblings, there were 5 different spellings of the last name. So, so the name Brassieur, that some people say, well, that's the same family, you know, and so it's just the name. By the way, the name seemed to be in flux during the time of the movement of Acadians to Louisiana way back then. There were more than one way to spell it, and really most people couldn't spell anyway. Right, they were directed or encouraged by either priests or whoever it was that filled out official papers. Well, I'm an associate professor of anthropology. I'm retired now from UL, where I taught there for 20 years, and then I've worked at numerous other universities around. Sure, I think, and the topic of ethnicity is one of my topics that I love to work with. But my own ethnicity, what I would call myself a Cajun. But I do so realizing that it's not a hard and fast kind of category. It's a category that changes over time too. And so one way of trying to understand what Cajun is, I believe, has to do with the shared history of this exile that happened years ago. So and especially for those people who are interested in their family enough to learn the generations back and all that, they will trace their usually paternal heritage, but it could be mother or father's side, and they trace it back to that story. And so that story of what we would call the Grand Dérangement, the big exile from Acadia, tends to be sort of like an anchor or maybe a glue that causes Acadians or Cajuns to see each other as kin or come from the same group and all that. And then otherwise there's a lot of other essential qualities, but those essentials change over time. So that shared historical is important. In 1763, the war ended, and France lost that war with England, and the government of France was expelled from North America. And after that point, it became possible for the migrant exiled Acadians, to look around and see where they could go, because otherwise they arrived in Baltimore as exiles and enemy exiles, because Baltimore was was under English rule, and I'm sure they were treated as such. They were treated as enemies, and it was a very, very hard time. But after the war ended, then Louisiana came under control of Spain. In 1763, they actually didn't get full control until several years after that, some years after that. And by 1767, it was possible to become part of a voyage on a chartered boat that left Baltimore and arrived in New Orleans. They did so in 1767. And at that time, Spain owned New Orleans, and they owned a lot of Louisiana, but they did not own the east bank of the Mississippi River above Bayou Manchac, including Baton Rouge. That was still English territory. So the Acadians that came from Baltimore were established in a community called St. Gabriel. And it's still there today, and their first church that they built there is still there. It's the oldest churches, Acadian churches. And the reason for that, they used the Acadians as a buffer against the English who were on the territory right on the other side of Bayou Manchac. And they stayed there for a while and then still looking for a place. It really is the story of migration, the Acadian story. And my own family story is just another one of the stories of migration. So from St. Gabriel, there was a historical moment when Spain was expanding their territory, and the Acadians altogether made up a large percentage of the population relatively, because they were newcomers into a sparsely populated area. And they were used again, as buffers. So one of the ways to do that was to build up these posts out here called the Attakapaw Post and the Opelousas Post. So they were already there, but by sending Acadians and providing land for them and the incentive to move out there, they built up other buffers, against other populations that might come. Eventually the Americans would be coming in anyway. Yeah. But so they did move from St. Gabriel to a place called Bellevue. And Bellevue today is not very noticeable along the road from Sunset to Opelousas. It's in between Sunset and Opelousas. And but at that time, it was one of the earliest established communities there, and it was Acadians from Baltimore mostly who went out there. When the Acadians arrived, they, I'm sure, thought of their own group, as one solid group, although there was some diversity in the group that came anyway, because they already had mixed with Native Americans in the Maritimes, for one thing. And they had lived, by the way, in Acadia in general, the Acadians had been there for 150 years before the exile. So they had plenty of chance to mix, and culture had already syncretized or come together in a kind of a mix of traditions with the Native Americans in Acadia before they came. So I'm sure that helped them to deal with Native Americans who, in Louisiana, they wouldn't have seen that as a great, thing to be worried about or concerned with. It was a moment where, as the colony in Louisiana expanded, the Native Americans were on the run too. They were displaced as things occurred. So, and I'll also say that when the Acadians arrived in the 1760s, there already were Africans here. So there were slaves had come over, had been brought over already for 30, 40 or more years, and were around. And I'd say could be a couple of generations of slaves had been here before the Acadians arrived. So there was a process already, we call it creolization, where one group of people is placed in the context of another group, and they tend to blend, their cultures tend to blend, their language is, a compromise is made so that they can communicate culturally and linguistically and in all ways. And it's a special and a kind of must have been a magical moment, when that happened, but it already was well under, by the time the Acadians arrived. But it continued, and it continued the communities. Generally speaking, the Acadians were provided land grants, and the land grant had a certain place on earth, so it's a certain place. Now, at first they didn't have any slaves, the Acadians themselves, not at first, but eventually, there were other land grants and land holdings where plantations were developed that did have slaves. So there were slaves in the neighborhood. Every neighborhood that they went to, there were slaves there. And the Indians and the slaves you could think of them as on the border of the Acadian, always there, And each had their own advantages in a certain way. The Native Americans here, of course, had thousands of years of adaptation to this environment and to the resources around, and they were the knowledgeable people with regard to plants and wildlife and everything else. So they were very important in that colony, and also how to go to get places, where to go, what stream to take to get to another place and all that. It was the journey from St. Gabriel to Bellevue must have been a horrendous thing. It could not have happened without Native Americans. Yeah. The natives knew how to get across the Atchafalaya Swamp, without, and then, the slaves also had their own culture. They didn't come over here as blank slates. They came from different nations of Africa, each with their own particular skills. Some of the black slaves that came initially were brought from West Africa because of their expertise in taking care of cattle, because cattle was the first industry really that was available without having slave labor or without having a whole lot of labor for a plantation, a big plantation. At first, that big plantation wasn't there. But cattle could be raised, and they were raised at large, so that if you had some cattle, and then they would multiply on the range, and there was a system then developed to put brands on them so that you could identify a person's cattle could be identified that way. And then, however, the people who actually worked on those kinds of ranches ended up being Indians and slaves, along with the Acadians. So that kind of workplace lifestyle, I'm sure, was there from the first. In history, we hear about and read and know about the eastern seaboard and the English people coming over and somehow or another trying to segregate the Indians as far as they could away from the white population. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. There was much more opportunity. And the kinds of intermarriage, by the way, and connections and intercultural connections that happened in Acadia continued to happen in Louisiana throughout that experience. So it wouldn't be surprising to know, that there's no such thing as a pure, absolute racial characteristic that could be Acadian necessarily, and Louisiana led to that kind of creolization that happened. Yeah, there was some absolute connections made at an early time, and so when you think of Creole, you can think of it in terms of language, those kinds of blends that occurred that affected the French language and the way that place names were called and all of that kind of thing. That's a kind of a combination of different languages that result in our place names and all that, and cuisine and all of that. So that creolization runs through all parts of culture, including intermarriage and family connections, and that absolutely happened. I had a chance to make this last weekend. I had a chance because it was Father's Day, and I took the chance to make makshu. Mm-hmm. So, corn was so important, mm-hmm. And makshu is something I grew up with, and there has to be a certain way to make it, and it's you can't go buy makshu. You can't buy it. You can buy it already made, but there's no outlet for makshu that I know. Maybe there is one somewhere, so I don't know. But anyway, it was something that everybody made. But it is a combination that suggests cultural combination. Yeah. So first of all, any kind of corn that is Native American, because they didn't come with corn. The Acadians from France, they didn't come with corn. And if it has tomatoes in it, that's also native to the Americas. That's right. There were no tomatoes in Europe at that time. So, and in addition to all the other spices, including those that have some piquant to them, that's here too. That was all native. That's all native kind of stuff. And so corn, to me, that's one of the kind of emblematic sort of dishes. But otherwise, I think a lot of us are familiar with the things that we can see in restaurants today, and it was part of the home cooking. Sometimes fewer people. One time I thought, as I was growing up and being a historian and trying to understand culture and all that kind of thing, I thought that maybe the element of culture that remains traditional the longest and it carries forth would be cuisine. But after living this much of my life, I don't know that that's true. Yeah. I really don't, because there's so many parts of what I think of as the traditional cuisine here that people don't bother with anymore. I don't know how many people make a roux anymore. Well, you can buy them. You can buy a roux easily. You can obtain it very easily. And so people don't make it. And maybe they don't know how. Maybe it's so simple to make, except what you need to know to make a roux is experience. That's right. And if you don't make it, you don't have the experience. Right. Well, during my lifetime, I'll say, even though I was born and raised in East Texas, I spent maybe most of lots and lots of weekends in Louisiana, and visiting and summers in Louisiana. And I still thought of Louisiana as my home, even though I was in Texas. But I just happened to live in a family and in a neighborhood that had other families that were kin to ours. So I heard French from infancy all my life in Texas, So it was French, and a lot of French was going on. So I was of a generation that had enough experience with it and enough ear for it, and heard it, that with a little bit of effort I could retain it, and then I can use it now, to speak to French people internationally, which is a great benefit. Has been to me, and I always wanted my child and my children to learn, the youngsters to learn French, and I've spent a lot of time with that. When Codafil came along, and tried to support the language. And I've been, in various ways, I've been involved in that, and still am, really. And yet, over the years, I don't know that that's going to be an essential character of our culture, anymore. I don't know if it will be. I know there's some. I love to see the young people who do and they're exceptional people that do speak French, play the music and everything and all that kind of stuff. You know, when you look at the population of the subdivisions in Lafayette, and you look at who lives there, and there's a large percentage of African descended people who are living in Lafayette. There's a lot of them in certain neighborhoods. Freetown is one where you have plenty. But when you look at what their names are Mouton, Broussard, Mo, Thibodeau. They're Acadian surnames. So what's the meaning of that? The meaning is, it can be varied, but for one thing for sure is that there are interrelated families. You know, and the extent of interrelation has not been appreciated. Right. So in other words, maybe there's some people who would say no, that absolutely I would never be related to that person. Well, they may be surprised to learn how close they are. Oh, yeah.